A phone vibrates on black marble at 4:03 a.m., screen lighting up with a name that no longer exists in Choi Sung-jae's world. A name he personally deleted from every server, every contact list, every corner of himself he could reach. A name that should be gone. It isn't. We are introduced to Choi Sung-jae, a man who exists in the space between a throne and a kill order. He doesn't run Seoul's most feared syndicate with brutality. He runs it with architecture. Every person in their place. Every outcome accounted for. Every weakness cauterized before it can bleed. Other alphas perform power. Sung-jae is power, cold, precise, and absolute. But there is one name his architecture never fully erased: Young Ha-jun. The Omega who never performed softness, never asked for protection, never needed anything from him, and who vanished 1 year ago without a single word, leaving behind nothing but silence and a wound Sung-jae refuses to name. The stakes fracture open the moment he answers. Ha-jun's voice, exhausted, fractured, calling from what sounds like a hospital, delivers 4 words that dismantle 20 years of iron in under 3 seconds. It's your son. He's not breathing. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers and tell me where you're watching from. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light, the kind of sterile, humming quiet that only exists at 4 a.m., when the world has narrowed down to machines in waiting. Choi Sung-jae walked through the automatic doors of Seoul Central Medical like he owned the building, because in a technical sense, through 3 layers of shell corporations, he did. 2 of his men flanked him at a distance, close enough to matter, far enough to be invisible. His jaw was set. His coat was still on from the night's work. There was a faint smell of gunpowder at his collar that the antiseptic couldn't quite compete with. He had not called ahead. He never called ahead. The night nurse at the maternity wing desk looked up and immediately looked back down, which was the correct instinct. A man like Sung-jae didn't need to raise his voice to fill a room. He simply stood in the center of it and waited, and the room reorganized itself around him. The nurse typed something. A senior staff member appeared from a back corridor with the practiced calm of someone pretending they weren't nervous. Choi Sung-jae, he said. Not a question. Room 7. Down the hall, second left. The patient has been. She's been asking if anyone was coming. She. Sung-jae didn't correct him. He walked the corridor alone. His men stayed at the entrance. This, whatever this was not something he wanted witnesses for. Room 7 had a narrow window beside the door, and through it, before he pushed it open, he saw Ha-jun. He made himself stop, made himself look properly before entering, because some part of him had spent the last 40 minutes in the back of a car telling himself he was prepared. That whatever he found, he would process it the same way he processed everything. With distance, with calculation, with the part of himself that had learned very early that feeling things quickly was how people got killed. Ha-jun was in the bed closest to the window, propped at a slight incline, for line running into the back of his left hand. He was pale in a way that made the fluorescent light look kind by comparison. Pale the way paper is pale, the way something is pale when it has given most of what it had. His eyes were closed. His hair was pushed back from his face, and there was a dried tear track on his left cheek that no one had wiped away, and Sung-jae stood in the corridor and looked at it and felt something move in his chest that he did not have a name for. He pushed the door open. Ha-jun's eyes opened immediately. Not the slow blink of someone waking, but the sharp snap of someone who had not been sleeping at all, only waiting with their eyes closed because it was easier than staring at the ceiling. He looked at Sung-jae in the doorway, and something passed over his face that was not relief and not fear and not anger, but contained all 3, pressed down under a layer of exhaustion so complete it had become its own kind of calm. You came, Ha-jun said. His voice was rough, still recognizable, still the voice that Sung-jae had spent 12 months trying to stop hearing in quiet rooms. You called. Sung-jae stepped inside and let the door close behind him. He didn't move closer. Not yet. Where is he? Ha-jun's eyes cut to the left, toward a second door. One Sung-jae hadn't registered, slightly ajar, the glow of NICU equipment bleeding through the gap in pale blue and amber. They let me keep the door open, Ha-jun said, so I can hear the monitors. Sung-jae crossed the room and pushed the door open and stopped. The NICU was small, 2 incubators, only 1 occupied. The infant inside was impossibly small. That was the first thought before anything else, impossibly small. Wired and monitored and sleeping under a warming lamp, chest rising and falling in the steady, fragile rhythm that monitors converted into a soft, continuous beep. A card on the incubator read the weight, the gestational age, a string of clinical numbers that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Sung-jae moved to the glass. He looked at the child's face, really looked, The way he hadn't allowed himself to look at Ha-jun, without armor, without calculation, and felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with any physical threat. The jaw. Even at this size, even at this age, there it was, his own jaw, squared and stubborn, miniaturized into something that had no right to be so small and still so unmistakably his. The line of the brow. The faint furrow even in sleep, like the child was already solving a problem, already refusing to yield to something. He stood there for a long moment. When he came back into the room, Ha-jun was watching him with the careful stillness of someone who has been bracing for impact for a very long time. How long was he not breathing? Sung-jae asked. 4 minutes. Before the paramedics got there. Ha-jun's hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. He's stable now. They said he's stable. But he came early, 3 weeks early, and his lungs, he stopped. Pressed his lips together. They're watching him. What do the doctors say? Specifically. That he's strong. Ha-jun's voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, and he pulled it back like he was pulling a thread taut. They keep saying he's strong. Sung-jae pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat down beside the bed. Not close enough to touch. Just close enough that Ha-jun didn't have to raise his voice. He looked at him. At the foreline, at the pallor, at the exhaustion that had settled into the lines around his eyes like it had been living there for months. You were alone, Sung-jae said. It wasn't a question. Ha-jun looked at the window. I made a choice to be alone. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched between them, thin and taut. Outside, somewhere down the corridor, a cart wheeled past. A monitor beeped once, adjusted, settled. Yes, Ha-jun said finally. I was alone. Sung-jae said nothing. He looked at his own hands. The same hands that had run a syndicate for 8 years, that had signed documents and broken negotiations and done things that had no place in a room like this. And he thought about the child in the next room with his jaw and his furrowed brow and 3 weeks less preparation for the world than he deserved. His name, Sung-jae said. Ha-jun turned back to look at him then. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of it. Like he had been waiting for demands, for accusations, for the version of Sung-jae that arrived in rooms like a weather system, and had not prepared for this. Seo-jun, Ha-jun said quietly. I named him Seo-jun. Choi Sung-jae looked at the door to the NICU. At the pale amber light coming through the gap. At the steady, soft rhythm of the monitor that meant his son was still breathing. He sat back in the chair. He wasn't going anywhere. The night didn't move. That was the thing about hospitals at this hour. Time didn't pass so much as accumulate, pooling in corners, pressing against the windows. The monitor in the next room kept its steady count. Ha-jun had been given something for pain an hour before Sung-jae arrived, and it had taken the sharpest edges off his body without touching anything else. So he lay in the reclined bed feeling simultaneously numb and exquisitely aware of every word in the room. Sung-jae had not moved from the chair. He hadn't asked for an explanation yet. That was the thing Ha-jun hadn't prepared for, the waiting. He had rehearsed versions of this conversation for a year. Rehearsed them in the small apartment in Busan, in the back of taxis, lying awake at 3 a.m. with his hands over his stomach talking quietly to a child who couldn't yet hear him. He had prepared for anger, for coldness, for the particular variety of Choi Sung-jae's silence that meant a decision had already been made and you were simply waiting to be informed of it. He had not prepared for Sung-jae to just sit there, elbows on his knees, and wait. You want to know why I left, Ha-jun said. Not a question. An opening. Sung-jae looked at him. I want to know what happened. There's a difference. Ha-jun looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent panel above the bed had a faint flicker to it. Barely perceptible, the kind of thing you only noticed in complete silence. He had been noticing it for 6 hours. I was 3 months along, he said. I didn't know how to tell you. I kept starting the conversation in my head and not being able to finish it because I didn't know what you would. He stopped. Reorganized. I was still trying to figure out how to tell you when they came. The air in the room changed. Sung-jae didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the quality of his stillness shifted, from waiting to something else. Ha-jun felt it without looking at him. 2 men, Ha-jun continued. They came to the apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. I thought they were yours at first. Same type. Same way of standing in a doorway like they're doing you a favor by not filling it completely. He paused. They weren't yours. Whose were they? Sung-jae said. Very quiet. Very level. They said they represented the Choi family's senior interests. Ha-jun turned his head and looked at him then, directly, steadily, the way he had always looked at Sung-jae, without flinching, which was one of the first things that had ever made Sung-jae look back. They knew about the pregnancy. I don't know how. They knew the gestational age. They knew I hadn't told you. They knew the address of the clinic I'd been using. He let that land. They were thorough. Sungjae's jaw had tightened. Ha-jun watched it happen. The small, controlled movement of a man who had learned very young to keep his reactions below the surface. What did they say? Sungjae said. They were very polite about it. Ha-jun's voice was flat, not from coldness, but from the particular exhaustion of having turned something over so many times it had worn smooth. That's what I remember most. How polite they were. One of them sat down. He had good shoes. He explained that the Choi bloodline had very specific requirements for continuation. That an Omega-born heir, unregistered, raised outside the family structure, would represent he searched for the word. A complication. That was the word they used. Complication. He exhaled slowly. And then the one who was still standing said that complications had a way of not surviving to full term, when the family had an interest in resolving them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has mass, that presses against the walls of a room and makes the air feel thicker. Sungjae had gone very, very still. Not the stillness of someone processing. Ha-jun had seen Sungjae process things before. There was a quality to it, a slight movement behind the eyes, the faint working of a calculation. This was different. This was the stillness of something that had stopped. Like a mechanism that had received input it was not built to handle and had simply paused. They threatened the child, Sungjae said. Each word placed down separately, carefully, like something fragile that might detonate. They informed me of the family's position, Ha-jun said. And they gave me a number. A transfer amount. Enough to disappear comfortably. Enough that they could tell themselves it was a transaction and not, he stopped. They gave me 72 hours to be gone. And you went. I went. Ha-jun didn't look away. I know what you're thinking. That you would have protected us. That if I had called you, you should have called me. The control in Sungjae's voice was absolute and terrible. Ha-jun, you should have. Called the man whose father just threatened to kill my child? Ha-jun's voice didn't rise, but something sharpened in it. Something that had been waiting quietly under the exhaustion. I was alone and pregnant and terrified, and the two men who had just told me my baby was a liability had just walked out of my apartment. What exactly was I supposed to say to you? How was I supposed to know which side of that door you were standing on? The words hit the room and stayed there. Sungjae looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not the controlled microexpressions Ha-jun had spent 2 years learning to read, but something raw, something that had come up from somewhere below the architecture. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had been shown a room in his own house he didn't know existed and couldn't yet process what was inside it. I wasn't on his side, Sungjae said. I know that, Ha-jun said quietly. I know that now. I think I knew it then too, in the part of me that wasn't terrified. He looked at his hand, at the 4-line, the small bruise forming around the insertion point. But knowing something and being able to act on it are two different things when someone has just told you your child's life depends on how quickly you can vanish. The monitor beeped. Steady, soft, unchanged. Sungjae stood up. He didn't go to the window, didn't pace. He just stood, like he needed to be vertical, like the chair had become a place he couldn't stay. He turned toward the NICU door, and Ha-jun watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the thing happening inside him that had no outward name. A year, Sungjae said to the door, to the amber light coming through the gap. You carried him and delivered him and sat in this room alone because my father sent 2 men in good shoes. Ha-jun didn't answer. The answer was already in the room. Sungjae turned back around. His face had resettled into something that looked like calm and wasn't. Ha-jun knew the difference. This was not calm. This was what happened when a very specific, very dangerous kind of decision had been made, and the man who made it was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it. You should sleep, Sungjae said. I'll be here when you wake up. Ha-jun looked at him. Sungjae. Sleep, he said again. Not unkind. Final. He sat back down in the chair, turned it slightly toward the NICU door, and folded his hands. The monitor kept its count. Outside, Seoul moved toward morning without them, indifferent and vast, and in the amberlit quiet of room 7, Choi Sung-jae sat with the full weight of what his father had done and did not move, and did not speak, and did not look away from the door where his son was breathing. Morning came in through the hospital window sideways, pale and unhurried, the kind of Seoul dawn that arrives without announcement and illuminates everything it touches with equal indifference. Ha-jun was asleep. He had fought it for another hour after Sung-jae told him to. Had kept his eyes open with the particular stubbornness that Sung-jae remembered, the refusal to yield to anything, including his own body, and then had lost, suddenly and completely, the way the exhausted always do. His breathing had evened out. His hand had relaxed against the blanket. Sung-jae had watched it happen and felt something that was not quite tenderness and not quite grief but lived in the same neighborhood as both. At 6 a.m., he stepped into the corridor and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Min Taeyong, his second-in-command. 7 years in, the only man in the syndicate whose loyalty Sung-jae had never once had reason to audit. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Sung-jae gave him 4 sentences, a location, an instruction, a name, and a warning. Min Taeyong said nothing for 3 seconds, then said, "Understood," and hung up. That was why Sung-jae trusted him. He never asked questions that weren't his to ask. The second call was shorter. A single name spoken into the phone, a room number, and the words, "Bring the ledger." The old one. The man on the other end, an archivist who had served the Choi family for 22 years and whose continued employment depended entirely on Sung-jae's goodwill, confirmed he would be there within the hour. By 7:15 a.m., there were 4 people in the corridor outside room 7 who had not been there at dawn. Ha-jun woke to the sound of low voices and found Sung-jae standing at the foot of his bed, jacket straightened, expression arranged into something that Ha-jun recognized as his working face. The one that meant the part of him that ran things had fully taken over from whatever had been sitting quietly in the chair all night. "What's happening?" Ha-jun said. Not alarmed. Careful. Something that needs to happen. Sung-jae looked at him. "You don't need to do anything. You don't need to speak or sign or perform. I'm going to need you to be awake and present, and I need you to understand what it means when it's done." Ha-jun pushed himself upright, wincing at the pull of the 4-line. "Sung-jae." "He's mine," Sung-jae said. "Simple. Absolute. I'm making it a matter of record. Today. Before anything else moves." He paused. "No one touches what's mine. That's not sentiment. That's architecture." Ha-jun looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and reached up to push his hair back from his face with his free hand, and said, "Then do it." What followed was not a ceremony. It was a declaration, which in the structure of the Choi Syndicate was something considerably more binding. The archivist came in with a leather-bound ledger that smelled of age and had Sung-jae's father's handwriting on the first 40 pages. Sung-jae didn't look at those pages. He turned to a clean one near the back. Min Taeyong stood at the door as witness, along with 2 senior figures from the syndicate's inner council, who had arrived looking like men who had been summoned without being told why and were already unhappy about it. Sung-jae wrote Seo-jun's name in his own hand. Below it, his own. Below that, Ha-jun's. He signed it, dated it, and pressed his seal, the one he wore on a chain beneath his shirt, the one that had never once been used for anything personal, only operational, into the wax that the archivist produced with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before under very different circumstances. He passed the ledger to Min Taeyong, who countersigned without hesitation. The 2 council members exchanged a look. One of them, a man named Beck, older, silver-haired, who had been part of the syndicate since before Sung-jae's father took control, cleared his throat. "This is irregular," Beck said carefully. "The senior patriarch hasn't been consulted on a bloodline registration since he ran things," Sung-jae said, without looking up from the ledger. "He doesn't run things." He closed the cover and handed it back to the archivist. "Make 3 copies. 1 to the family vault, 1 to the council record, 1 to my attorney. Today." Beck opened his mouth, closed it, nodded stiffly and left. The room exhaled. Min Taeyong waited until the others had gone, then stepped closer to Sung-jae and said very quietly, "It's already moving. Someone called it in before I got here. I don't know who, but the timing." "I know," Sung-jae said. "He'll send someone." "I know." Min Taeyong looked at Ha-jun in the bed, at the NICU door ajar beside him, and something passed through his expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration. "I'll stay on the floor," he said and left. Ha-jun had been watching all of it from the bed with the focused, quiet attention of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that understanding a situation completely was the only real protection available to him. When they were alone again, he said, "Your father is going to hear about this within the hour." "He already has," Sung-jae said. "And you did it anyway." "I did it first." Sung-jae turned to look at him then, fully, directly. "There's a difference." Ha-jun absorbed that. Outside, a cart wheeled past in the corridor. The NICU monitor kept its soft, unbroken count. The enforcer arrived at 9:40 a.m. Ha-jun heard him before he saw him. Heard the particular quality of silence that preceded him down the corridor, the way noise organized itself around a certain type of presence. He was a large man, not broad so much as dense, with a face that had been rearranged by violence enough times that it had settled into permanent impassivity. His name was Kong. Ha-jun had seen him once before, at a distance, at a function he had attended on Sung-jae's arm 2 years ago. He had thought then that Kong was the kind of man who was never off duty. He thought that now too. Kong stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved across the room. Ha-jun, the bed, the NICU door, Sung-jae standing beside the window, with the methodical efficiency of inventory. Then he looked at Sung-jae and said, "Your father sends his regards." "I'm sure he does," Sung-jae said. "He'd like to discuss the registration." Kang's voice was uninflected, which was its own kind of menace. "He feels the timing is premature, that there are family considerations that weren't." "Tell my father," Sung-jae said, and his voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but somehow more present, as though every word were occupying exactly the space it needed and no more. "That the registration is complete, witnessed, sealed, and filed. Tell him that the child in that room carries my name as of this morning. And tell him," he paused, just briefly, just enough to let the weight of what came next arrive before the words did, "that if anyone enters this floor who isn't medical staff or someone I've cleared personally, I will consider it an operational declaration. And I will respond accordingly." Kong looked at him for a long moment. Whatever calculation was happening behind his impassive face took its time completing. "I'll pass that along," he said. He left without looking at Ha-jun, without looking at the NICU door, without a single wasted movement. His footsteps receded down the corridor and disappeared. Ha-jun let out a slow breath. "That's not the end of it," he said. "No," Sung-jae agreed. He turned back to the window, to the pale morning light, to whatever he was looking at that wasn't in the room. "It's the beginning of it." The hospital room had become a kind of command center by midday, which was not something its designers had anticipated. Min Taeyong had stationed 2 men at the stairwell exits. A third sat in the waiting area at the end of the corridor reading a newspaper he hadn't turned a page of in 2 hours. The nursing staff had adapted with the professional pragmatism of people who had learned that certain patients came with complications that fell outside standard intake procedures, and had decided, collectively, that as long as no one was bleeding in the hallways, it wasn't their crisis to manage. Sung-jae had requisitioned the family consultation room across the hall. It was a small room, 2 chairs, a table, a box of tissues that had never been moved from the corner, and he had turned it into something else entirely within 40 minutes. Laptop open. Encrypted relay running through 3 separate servers. A phone that wasn't his standard line. The door closed. Ha-jun was asleep again, which was good. The doctor had come at 11, reviewed the NICU monitors, used the word improving twice in a tone that sounded like he meant it, and Ha-jun had held himself together through the entire conversation with focused, white-knuckled composure, and then had been asleep within 10 minutes of the doctor leaving. His body was collecting every debt it was owed. Sung-jae sat in the consultation room and worked. He had built the syndicate's data architecture himself, had designed the encryption layers, the access hierarchies, the buried partition where the most sensitive records were stored in formats that required 3 simultaneous credentials to open. He had designed it to be impenetrable to outsiders. The problem with that, he was discovering, was that it had never needed to be impenetrable to him. His father had assumed that Sung-jae's loyalty to the family was structural, permanent, load-bearing, not subject to revision. His father had assumed incorrectly. The outer partition took 6 minutes. The secondary layer took 19. The third, the one his father had added 2 years ago without informing him, which told Sung-jae something he filed away for later, took the better part of an hour and a level of focused, clinical patience that was only possible because he had locked the door and told Min Taeyong not to interrupt him unless the building was on fire. He found the file at 1:47 p.m. It was not labeled with Ha-jun's name. It was labeled with a case number, a format his father used for operational matters he considered resolved. Sung-jae had seen the format hundreds of times. He had never once imagined finding it applied here. He opened it and read it without moving. The document was thorough. His father was always thorough. The initial surveillance report was dated 14 months ago, 2 months before Ha-jun had even known about the pregnancy, which meant the surveillance had begun before that, which meant his father had been watching Ha-jun while Ha-jun was still in Sung-jae's life, still sleeping in his apartment, still sitting across from him at breakfast, and Sung-jae had not known, had not detected it, had not, in 8 years of running an intelligence operation, noticed that the one person he had allowed into his private life was being catalogued by his own father. He sat with that for a moment. Then he kept reading. The threat delivery was documented with the same bureaucratic precision as everything else. Date, time, operatives assigned. 2 names he recognized, both senior field men, both currently active. The instruction was written in his father's characteristic passive construction, the kind of language that described actions without assigning them to an actor. The asset is to be relocated. Relocation is to be permanent if the primary directive is not fulfilled within 72 hours. Permanent relocation. His father's preferred euphemism. There was a payment record attached. A transfer, already processed, to an account Sung-jae recognized as a cutout his father used for contracted work. The kind of work that didn't appear in any operational ledger. The amount was not large. That was the detail that landed hardest, somehow. Not the threat, not the surveillance, not the clinical language, but the amount. His father had placed a value on Ha-jun's life, and on the life of the child growing inside him, and the number was not large. Sung-jae closed the laptop. He sat in the small room with a box of tissues in the corner and the door closed, and he allowed himself 60 seconds. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He simply sat with the full weight of what he had found and let it be what it was, which was the clearest possible evidence that the man who had raised him had looked at the person Sung-jae loved and at the child that love had made, and had assigned them a line item on a contract. 60 seconds. Then he stood up, opened the door, and crossed the corridor to room 7. Ha-jun woke when he heard the door, instantly alert in that way he had been since the night before. He looked at Sung-jae's face and went still. "Tell me," Ha-jun said. Sung-jae sat down in the chair. His chair, the one he had occupied since 4 a.m., the one that had probably taken on the shape of a permanent decision by now, and told him. Not everything. The structure of it. The surveillance, the timing, the document, the payment. Ha-jun listened without interrupting. When Sung-jae finished, the room was very quiet. "He paid someone," Ha-jun said. Not a question. Processing it out loud the way people process things that their minds needed time to accept as real. "The payment cleared 11 months ago," Sung-jae said. "Before Seo-jun was born. The contract was contingent. If you disappeared, it was suspended. If you resurfaced," he stopped. "It reactivated," Ha-jun said. "Yes." Ha-jun looked at the NICU door. At the amber light. At the steady evidence of his son still breathing. "So when I called you last night, you activated it." Sung-jae's voice was level, precise, and completely without comfort, because false comfort was something he had never offered Ha-jun and wasn't going to start now. He would have had confirmation of your location within hours of your admission. "The hospital system isn't clean. There are access points I've known about for years." He paused. Kang's visit this morning wasn't just a message. He was assessing. Ha-jun absorbed that. He didn't look afraid, which was one of the things about him. He moved through fear the same way he moved through everything, by understanding it completely before deciding what to do with it. "How long do we have here?" "Not long," Sung-jae said. "Seo-jun needs 48 more hours minimum before the doctors will clear a transfer. I've already spoken to a private facility, secure, off any network my father can access." He looked at Ha-jun directly. "I need you to trust me for 48 hours. "I trusted you before," Ha-jun said quietly. "That's a more complicated statement than it sounds." "I know what it costs you," Sung-jae said. "I'm asking anyway." The silence between them had a different texture than the silences of the night before. Less raw, more weighted. The weight of people who had arrived at a moment where every available path forward required something they weren't certain they had left. Ha-jun looked at him for a long time. At the face he had memorized and tried to forget. At the man sitting in a hospital chair in yesterday's clothes with the evidence of his father's betrayal somewhere behind his eyes. Asking for 48 hours like it was a reasonable thing to ask. 48 hours, Ha-jun said. Sung-jae nodded once. He took out his phone and began making the calls that would need to be made, and Ha-jun turned toward the NICU door. And outside the consultation room across the hall the laptop sat closed on a table with a file open inside it that had changed the shape of everything, and neither of them said another word for a very long time. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. The transfer happened at 4 a.m. on the second day. The same hour everything in this story seemed to insist on beginning. Sung-jae had chosen the time deliberately. His father's surveillance ran on human schedules, and humans, even contracted ones, were least attentive in the hour before dawn when the body's chemistry conspired against vigilance. The private medical team arrived in an unmarked vehicle. The NICU equipment had been pre-cleared for transport. Seo-jun was moved in a portable incubator that cost more than most people's cars and hummed with the quiet efficiency of technology that had been designed specifically for moments like this one. Ha-jun walked out of Seoul Central Medical on his own feet, which he had insisted on with a quiet firmness that invited no negotiation. He was pale and moved carefully, one hand braced against Min Taeyong's arm with the dignity of someone accepting assistance while refusing to acknowledge needing it. Sung-jae walked on his other side and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that Ha-Jun's body wasn't already saying for him. The convoy moved through the pre-dawn city in 3 vehicles. Ha-Jun sat in the middle car with the portable incubator secured beside him and his hand resting against the unit's side panel, maintaining contact the way he had maintained contact through 2 days of NICU glass, not quite touching, but present. Sung-jae sat across from him and watched Seoul pass outside the window and thought about 48 hours and what came after them. The estate was in the hills north of the city. Sung-jae had purchased it 6 years ago through a subsidiary that didn't exist on paper in any form traceable to the Choi family, which meant his father didn't know about it, which meant it was currently the safest place he owned. It sat behind 2 security perimeters, a gate system that required biometric confirmation, and enough camera coverage that nothing larger than a determined house cat could approach undetected. It was also, Sung-jae registered for the first time as the convoy passed through the outer gate, entirely without softness. All glass and steel, and clean geometric lines. Architecture that communicated one thing very efficiently: nothing gets in. It had not been designed for a newborn. Min Taeyong had sent people ahead. There was a room on the ground floor, one Sung-jae had used as a secondary office, that had been cleared and outfitted in the hours before their arrival. A proper crib beside the medical-grade monitoring equipment. Warm light instead of the estate's standard cold recessed panels. A chair beside the crib that had not been there before. Someone had put a blanket over it, soft, pale yellow, the kind of detail that Min Taeyong would never have chosen himself, which meant he had sent someone specifically to choose it, which was the kind of loyalty that operated without being asked. Ha-Jun stood in the doorway of the room for a moment before going inside. He looked at the crib, at the monitoring equipment, at the pale yellow blanket on the chair, and his throat moved once. Then he went in and sat down and didn't say anything, and Sung-jae understood that some things needed to be received in silence. The medical team settled Seo-jun into the crib with practiced efficiency, checking connections, confirming readings, transferring the monitoring feeds to the estate's secure system. The lead physician, a woman who had the manner of someone entirely unbothered by unusual circumstances, ran Ha-Jun through the care instructions with calm precision and told him to sleep when the baby slept, which Ha-Jun acknowledged with a polite nod of someone who had no intention of complying. When the medical team withdrew to the adjacent room and Min Taeyong had closed the door, and the estate settled into its particular brand of reinforced quiet, Sung-jae stood at the side of the crib and looked at his son. Seo-jun was awake. That was new. In the hospital he had been mostly sleeping, conserving whatever resources 48 hours of determined survival had cost him. But he was awake now, in the warm light of the room his father's lieutenant had furnished in the pre-dawn hours, looking up at the ceiling with the unfocused, ancient concentration of a newborn encountering existence. "You can hold him," Ha-Jun said from the chair. His voice was quiet, without agenda. Informational. Sung-jae looked at him, then back at the baby. "I know how to hold," he started. "You're gripping the crib rail," Ha-Jun said. Sung-jae looked down at his hands. He was, in fact, gripping the crib rail. He released it. The silence stretched for a moment, and then Ha-Jun stood, slowly, carefully, and reached into the crib with the fluid confidence of someone who had been doing this alone for the 48 hours since Seo-jun's birth, which he had been. He lifted the baby with both hands, supporting the head with a practiced ease that Sung-jae watched and could not quite categorize, and held him out. Sung-jae took him. The weight was, wrong was not the right word, surprising. Seo-jun weighed almost nothing, which Sung-jae knew in an abstract sense from the medical charts he had read 17 times. But knowing a number and receiving that weight into your hands were entirely different experiences. He adjusted his grip once, twice, settling the infant against his forearm the way the position seemed to demand, and Seo-jun turned his head slightly at the movement and made a sound. Not crying, just a small, reflexive noise, the sound of someone registering a change in their environment. Sung-jae stopped moving entirely. He stood in the warm light of the room with his son in his arms and did not know what to do with his hands, which was a sentence that had never once applied to him in any other context in his adult life. He ran a criminal organization. He had made decisions in seconds that other men agonized over for weeks. He had never, in memory, been uncertain of where to put his hands. He was uncertain now. "You're not going to break him," Ha-Jun said. He was watching with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite tenderness, but contained elements of both, complicated by everything else that lived behind his eyes when he looked at Sung-jae. "He's small, not fragile. There's a difference." "I know that," Sung-jae said. "You're holding your breath." Sung-jae exhaled. Seo-jun, apparently indifferent to the internal crisis of the most feared alpha in Seoul, settled against his father's arm and yawned. a full, consuming, deeply unbothered yawn, and then closed his eyes. Something happened in Sungjae's chest that he had no architecture for. Not a crack this time, not the clean fracture of the phone call, or the slow erosion of the hospital corridor. Something different. Something that moved through the existing structures of him without breaking them, finding the spaces between, occupying them quietly and permanently the way water finds the shape of whatever holds it. He stood there for a long time. Hajun sat back down in the chair with the pale yellow blanket and watched the man who had dismantled rivals and built empires stand absolutely still in a warm room in the hills, holding 4 kilograms of new life, and not move and not speak and not put him down. Outside, the city lightened toward morning. The estate's cameras made their silent rotations. Somewhere in Seoul, an old man was learning that his son had moved and had not left a forwarding address, and was beginning to understand that something had changed that could not be changed back. Inside, Sungjae held his son and learned the weight of what he had not known he was missing. The estate's outer perimeter alarm triggered at 2:17 a.m. Not a sound, but a vibration in Sungjae's phone, a specific pattern he had programmed himself. The one that meant the cameras had caught movement that the system had already ruled out as animal or environmental. He was awake before the second pulse. He had not been fully asleep. He was on his feet and at the door in 4 seconds. The corridor outside was dark and quiet in the way that estates at night are quiet, deep, insulated, the silence of thick walls and good construction. He moved down it without turning on lights, because he had walked every corridor of this building in the dark deliberately, 3 days after purchasing it, until the layout was as familiar to him as his own name. Left at the junction. 6 doors. The stairwell at the end. His phone showed him the camera feeds in a grid, 8 panels, small and green-tinted. The breach was at the eastern perimeter, where the tree line came closest to the outer wall. 3 figures, moving in the practiced formation of people who had done this before. Not rushing. Methodical. The kind of approach that understood patience as a tactical asset. His father had sent professionals. Of course he had. Sungjae went back to the room he'd been using. Not the nursery, he had taken the room adjacent, close enough to hear anything through the wall, and opened the case under the bed. He had moved it from the penthouse 4 days ago, along with everything else that mattered. He checked the weapon with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory and pocketed a second. Then he opened the connecting door to the nursery, just wide enough, and looked in. Hajun was already awake, already standing, already holding Seo Jun against his chest with both arms. He was looking at the door when it opened, which meant he had heard or felt something, or had simply never fully slept in a place that had not yet proven it could hold them. His eyes found Sungjae's in the dark. Sungjae held up 3 fingers, then pointed down toward the ground floor. Hajun's jaw tightened, but he nodded, pulling Seo Jun closer, one hand cradling the infant's head. "The closet," Sungjae said, "barely sound at all. Back wall. Stay down." "Don't tell me to stay calm," Hajun whispered. "I wasn't going to." He held Hajun's gaze for 1 second. "I'm coming back." He pulled the door to and moved toward the stairwell. Min Taeyong met him at the top of the stairs, dressed, armed, phone in hand, with the focused quiet of a man who had been in situations like this before and had survived them by thinking faster than the other side. He held up 4 fingers, revised it to 3, pointed toward the east wing ground floor and the service entrance. They went down together. The first man came through the service corridor 12 seconds later. He was good, silent, low, sweeping the space with the professional efficiency of someone who had been paid specifically for this kind of work. He was not good enough. Sungjae had spent 8 years building a syndicate on the principle that the difference between winning and losing came down to who understood the terrain and who was improvising. This was his terrain. The fight was brief and quiet, and left the man on the floor of the service corridor with a finality that Sungjae didn't permit himself to examine. He kept moving. The second operative had split from the first at the East Wing Junction. Standard breach protocol: divide the response, cover more ground. He was heading for the main staircase, which meant he had the building's layout, which meant Sungjae's father had given them schematics, which meant the breach had been planned with information that could only have come from inside access. He filed that too. Everything was data. Even now, Min Taeyong took the second man at the base of the stairs while Sungjae moved through the main hall toward the third camera position, where the last operative had stopped moving. Stationary targets were either waiting or setting something. Neither was acceptable. The third man was at the foot of the interior staircase that led directly to the upper residential floor. To the nursery. He was not waiting to be found. He had positioned himself as a terminal point, a guarantee, the contingency in case the first 2 failed. He was looking up the stairs when Sung-jae came through the side door, which was the advantage of knowing the building and the disadvantage of assuming your enemy would come from the direction you expected. The fight was not brief this time. The third operative was larger than the others and had the kind of trained physicality that came from years of specific preparation. He got a hand on Sung-jae's arm and used it, and for 30 seconds the hallway at the foot of the stairs was a very close, very ugly thing. Sung-jae took a hit to the ribs that would matter tomorrow. He returned it with interest. The operative hit the wall, and then the floor, and then didn't get up. Sung-jae stood over him at the foot of the stairs. His breathing was elevated. His ribs reported their complaint with steady, insistent clarity. He was holding his phone in his left hand. Somewhere in the last 30 seconds he had grabbed it from his pocket without registering why. And he looked down at it and saw the baby monitor app still open on the screen, the audio feed from the nursery running live, and heard through the small speaker the sound of Seo-jun beginning to fuss, a thin, rising sound, and Ha-jun's voice underneath it, very low, saying, I've got you, you're fine. He stood at the bottom of the stairs with the baby monitor in one hand and 3 of his father's men on the floor of his house, and listened to his son cry and his son's father talk him down from it, and something moved through him that was beyond anger, beyond the cold operational fury he had been running on for the last 4 minutes. Something older and more total, the kind of thing that didn't have a tactical application and didn't need one. He went upstairs. He knocked twice on the nursery door. Their signal, established without discussion, the way some things between them had always been established, and pushed it open. Ha-jun was in the corner behind the crib, Seo-jun pressed against his chest, one hand still moving in the slow circle across the infant's back that had apparently been working because the crying had diminished to a series of uneven, winding down sounds. He looked at Sung-jae in the doorway, at his face, at his hands, at the state of his jacket, and his expression did the thing it had been doing since the hospital, that compressed, controlled movement that contained more than it showed. It's done, Sung-jae said. Ha-jun looked at him for a long moment. Are you hurt? Ribs. Nothing structural. That's not nothing. It's nothing that changes anything. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at his son, who had wound down completely now and was making the small, irregular sounds of an infant returning to sleep against a warm chest. He's all right. He's all right. Ha-jun's voice was steady, which cost him something. Sung-jae could see the cost of it in the set of his shoulders, the careful control of his breathing. He slept through most of it. Good. Sung-jae looked at the baby monitor in his hand. He hadn't put it down. I heard you. Through the app. He paused, telling him he was fine. Ha-jun looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, the controlled steadiness giving way, just slightly, to something rawer underneath. Someone had to, he said quietly. Sung-jae nodded. He put the baby monitor down on the dresser. He crossed the room and sat on the floor beside the crib, back against the wall, and didn't say anything else. Ha-jun looked at him for a moment. Then he sat down too, Seo-jun still against his chest, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and outside the estate Min Taeyong was already making calls, and the cameras kept their rotations, and somewhere in Seoul an old man was waiting for a report that wasn't coming. And inside the nursery Choi Sung-jae sat on the floor with his ribs aching and his son breathing, and understood that the war had fully begun. Morning arrived the way it had been arriving all week, without ceremony, indifferent to what the night had cost. The estate's windows filled with gray light that became pale gold slowly, the hills absorbing the dawn at their own pace while inside. The damage from the night before was catalogued and quietly addressed. Min Taeyong handled the operational aftermath with the efficiency of a man who understood that some problems were solved most effectively by people who didn't ask questions and drove large vehicles. By 7 a.m. the ground floor corridor showed no evidence of what had happened at 217. By 8 a.m. the perimeter breach had been sealed and reinforced. By 9 a.m. Min Taeyong had placed the relevant calls and had a preliminary accounting of how his father's team had obtained the estate's schematics, which Sung-jae read over coffee without reacting. Because the answer was what he had suspected, and suspecting something and confirming it were emotionally different distances, even when they shouldn't be. Ha-jun had slept for 3 hours on the nursery floor with Seo-jun in the crib above him and Sung-jae against the opposite wall. Neither of them had discussed this arrangement. It had simply been the arrangement that made sense, and they had both understood it without speaking, which was one of the things about them that had always been true and had apparently survived a year of silence intact. The medical team confirmed at 10 a.m. that Seo-jun's oxygen levels had normalized and his feeding response had strengthened overnight. The lead physician used the word thriving once, carefully, as though she understood that in this particular room, hope required careful handling. Ha-jun thanked her. Sung-jae stood at the window and looked at the hills and felt the word land somewhere in his chest and stay there. It was after the medical team withdrew, after Min Taeyong had closed the estate's outer gates and posted the revised guard rotation. After the morning had settled into something that resembled, from a distance, normalcy, it was then that Ha-jun asked Sung-jae to sit down. Not in the nursery. In the main room at the front of the estate, with the tall windows and the view of the city below and the pale winter light coming through at an angle that made everything look considered, like a photograph taken by someone who understood composition. Sung-jae sat on one side of the low table. Ha-jun sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the quality of Ha-jun's silence told Sung-jae that what was coming had been prepared. Not rehearsed exactly, but carried for some time, turned over until its edges were known. Last night, Ha-jun started. Last night is handled, Sung-jae said. Last night, Ha-jun continued, with the patient, unbothered firmness of someone who had decided they were finishing a sentence regardless. Your father sent 3 men to kill our son. In a house you moved us to because the last location wasn't safe. He paused. And before that, there was a hospital. And before that, a contract. And before that, 2 men in good shoes in my apartment. He looked at Sung-jae steadily. I need you to understand that I am not drawing a line because I don't trust you. I need you to understand that distinction before I say what I'm going to say. Sung-jae looked at him. I'm listening. Ha-jun's hands were folded on the table. Still deliberate. You can be Seo-jun's father, he said. Or you can be the syndicate's alpha. But I will not raise our son in the shadow of what you do. He let the words settle before continuing. I watched you last night. I heard you come back up those stairs. I know what it cost you and I know what you're capable of, and I'm not saying any of this because I'm afraid of you. His voice was even and quiet and absolute. I'm saying it because that child in that room is going to grow up knowing what his father is, and I get to decide what that means. We get to decide, but only if you choose. The room held the words without echo. Sung-jae looked at the table, at Ha-jun's folded hands, at the pale winter light doing its considered work across the floor between them. You're giving me a choice, he said. I'm giving you 24 hours, Ha-jun said. Because I think you already know what you want to choose, and I think the 24 hours are for the part of you that built the thing you'd be walking away from. That part deserves time. Something moved in his expression, not softening exactly, but an acknowledgement of the weight of what he was asking. I'm not pretending it's a small thing, Sung-jae. I know what the syndicate is. I know what it cost to build it. I know it's the only architecture your father ever gave you that actually worked. He paused. I'm asking you to burn it down anyway. Sung-jae was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird moved through the pale sky beyond the window. A detail so ordinary it felt wrong in the context of everything else in the room. If I walk away from it, he said finally, the men inside it don't disappear. The operations don't disappear. Someone takes the seat and the seat doesn't change because I'm not in it. I know that. I'm not using it as an argument. I'm telling you what it looks like from where I'm sitting. He looked at Ha-jun directly. I'm telling you I've thought about this. Before last night, before this conversation, Ha-jun looked at him. And Sung-jae leaned back. He looked at the ceiling, at the clean, geometric lines of the estate he had built to be impenetrable and that had been breached anyway, because the threat had come from inside the family, which was the only place his architecture had never been designed to defend against because he had not allowed himself to believe it was necessary. My father built me to run the syndicate, he said. Every decision he made about who I should be was in service of that. The detachment. The architecture. He stopped. Ha-jun. The thing that made me capable of what I did last night. He built that deliberately. He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than if he had said it with bitterness. And then he pointed it at you. Ha-jun didn't look away. So when you ask me to choose, Sung-jae continued, you're asking me to dismantle the thing my father spent 30 years constructing inside me. Not just the organization. The version of myself that runs it. He looked at Ha-jun across the table. I want you to know that I understand that I'm not making this choice without knowing what it is. I know you're not, Ha-jun said quietly. 24 hours, Sung-jae said. 24 hours, Ha-jun confirmed. Sung-jae stood. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking at the city below. The city his father had taught him to read as a map of power, all leverage and access and consequence. He stood there for a long time. Behind him, Ha-jun didn't fill the silence. He never had. It was one of the things Sung-jae had loved about him, quietly, in the years before he had been willing to call it love, that he understood when a person needed their silence returned to them intact. The city sat in its winter light, patient and vast. waiting to see what the man at the window would decide to do with the thing he had built inside it. Sung-jae looked at it for a long time. Then he went to find Min Taeyong. The 24 hours did not look like deliberation from the outside. From the outside, from Min Taeyong's careful peripheral observation, from the medical team's tactful non-attention, from Ha-jun's watchful quiet, it looked like Sung-jae had simply resumed functioning. He reviewed the estate's revised security protocols. He ate. He spent 40 minutes in the nursery in the early evening, standing at the crib while Seo-jun slept, not touching anything, just present in the way he had learned to be present in that room. Still and watching, and allowing himself to want what was in front of him without immediately converting that want into a tactical objective. At 11 p.m., he sat at the table in the estate's back office and built the document. It took 3 hours. Not because the legal architecture was complicated. He had structured enough asset transfers to draft one in his sleep. But because precision mattered here more than it had ever mattered in any transaction he had previously executed. Every subsidiary, every account, every operational key, access credential, network login, and encrypted partition that constituted the living infrastructure of the Choi Syndicate. The document was 41 pages when he finished. He read it twice. Then he printed 2 copies, signed both, and put them in a plain envelope that he set on the corner of the desk. He slept for 4 hours, ate breakfast, checked on Seo-jun, who was doing what he had apparently decided to make his primary occupation, which was existing with increasing vigor and complete indifference to the geopolitical situation surrounding him. Ha-jun was feeding him when Sung-jae came in and looked up and read something in Sung-jae's face that made him go still for a moment. "Today," Ha-jun said. "Not a question." "This morning," Sung-jae said. Ha-jun looked at him for a long moment. The full, direct look that had always been one of his particular qualities. The willingness to see clearly and be seen clearly in return. Then he looked back down at Seo-jun and said quietly, "Come back." Sung-jae picked up the envelope from the desk. The meeting was at a private dining room in a building in Gangnam that the Choi family had used for sensitive conversations for 30 years. Neutral ground by tradition, which in this context was a formality both of them understood was purely ceremonial. Sung-jae arrived first. He had always arrived first to everything. He set the envelope on the table and sat with his hands folded and waited, and the room was very quiet and smelled faintly of the tea that had been set out and left to cool. Choi Dae-won arrived 12 minutes later. He was 71 years old and looked 60, which was the kind of thing that happened when a person spent their life in command rather than in consequence. He moved with the ease of a man who had not been uncertain of his welcome in any room for 40 years. He wore a charcoal suit. He looked at Sung-jae and at the envelope on the table and at the 2 cups of cooling tea, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite surprise. He had not survived this long by being surprised, but was its nearest available neighbor. He sat down. "You requested this meeting," Choi Dae-won said. His voice was the same as it had always been, measured, resonant, the voice of a man who had learned early that the person who controlled the pace of a conversation controlled its outcome. "I'll admit the channel you used was unusual." "I used Min Taeyong," Sung-jae said. "He's the most direct line that doesn't pass through anyone you've compromised." A faint pause. "That's a serious accusation. It's a documented fact." Sung-jae looked at his father across the table. Really looked, the way he had been looking at things differently since a hospital room 6 days ago, with less armor and more clarity. "I have the schematics transfer. I have the account the access was purchased through. I have the name of the man inside my network who sold it to you." He paused. "I'm not here to discuss it. I'm telling you I have it so that we both understand what the conversation is." Choi Dae-won was quiet for a moment. He looked at the envelope. "And that?" Sung-jae slid it across the table. His father opened it without hurry. He removed the document, both copies fanned slightly, and read with the focused, unhurried attention of a man reviewing a contract, which was exactly what he was doing. He read all 41 pages. Sung-jae waited. He had learned patience at this man's table, which meant he could outlast almost anyone, including the man himself. When Choi Dae-won set the document down, his expression had not changed in any way that a stranger would have detected. Sung-jae was not a stranger. "Everything," his father said. "Everything," Sung-jae confirmed. "Every account, every operation, every network and contact and infrastructure I built in 8 years. Transferred to you clean and complete, contingent on one condition. The Omega and the child. Their permanent safety. Documented, witnessed, and bound by enough legal architecture that any move against them becomes a move against the assets you're receiving." He held his father's gaze. "You want the syndicate. You've always wanted it back. You gave it to me because you thought I was an extension of you, and you've been correcting that assumption since the moment you realized I wasn't." He said it without heat. "Take it. It's yours. All of it. Every key I built, every door I opened, every network I spent 8 years constructing. In exchange for their lives. Permanently." The silence in the room was different from the silences in the estate. This one had weight and history. 30 years of a particular kind of father and a particular kind of son accumulated in every quiet corner of it. "You'd walk away," Choi Dae-won said. "From all of it." "I already have," Sung-jae said. "The document is a formality." Something moved across his father's face. It was not admiration, and it was not respect, and it was not grief, but it contained elements of all three pressed together into something that had no clean name. He looked at his son, perhaps actually looked, in the way that people sometimes look at the people closest to them only when something irrevocable is happening, and was quiet for a long time. "You understand what you're giving up," Choi Dae-won said. "I understand exactly what I'm giving up," Sung-jae said. "I built it. I know every part of it. I'm giving it to you anyway." He paused. "The question is whether you understand what you're giving me in return. Because if the answer to that question is no, if you sign this and it means nothing, then the documentation I mentioned earlier goes to every rival family, every external authority, and every international contact who would find it useful. Every account, every name, every operation going back 30 years. He let that sit. "I'm not threatening you. I'm explaining the architecture of the agreement." Choi Dae-won looked at him for a long moment. Something that might, in another man, have been respect passed through his expression and was gone. He reached into his jacket and produced a pen. His own pen, the one he had used for 30 years, a detail so characteristic it almost felt like punctuation, and signed both copies. He slid one back across the table. Sung-jae picked it up. He did not look at it again. He folded it once and placed it in his inside pocket and stood. "Sung-jae," his father said. He stopped. Didn't turn. "The boy," his father said. "What's his name?" The question sat in the room between them. Unexpected, and therefore more revealing than anything else his father had said or done in the last hour. Sung-jae stood with his back to the table and considered the question and what it cost his father to ask it and what it would cost him to answer. "Seo-jun," he said. He walked out into the gray winter morning and did not look back, and behind him in the private dining room Choi Dae-won sat alone with a cup of cold tea and 41 pages that had just given him everything he had ever wanted, and Sung-jae walked to the car where Min Tae-yong was waiting, and got in, and said nothing for a very long time, and watched Seoul move past the window like a city he was seeing for the last time and the first time simultaneously. 3 years is enough time for a city to forget. Not completely. Seoul had a long memory for power, and the name Choi Sung-jae still moved through certain rooms the way the memory of weather moves through old bones, felt rather than seen. But the man himself had become something that the city's appetite for danger found difficult to sustain interest in. Quiet. Domestic. Unremarkable in all the ways that mattered to people whose business was fear. He had, by most available measures, disappeared. The house was in Mapo, on a street that had a bakery at one end and a school at the other, and a persistence of ordinary noise throughout the day that Sung-jae had found disorienting for approximately the first 3 months, and had stopped noticing entirely somewhere around month 4. It was not a small house, but it was not the estate. It had no perimeter cameras, no security rotation, no reinforced glass. It had a garden that Sung-jae had attempted to maintain with the same systematic approach he applied to everything, and that had produced, after 2 growing seasons, something that a charitable person would describe as enthusiastic. It had a kitchen with a window that faced east, which meant it caught the morning light at an angle that did things to the room that Sung-jae had never once thought he would have opinions about and now, apparently, did. It was in this kitchen, on a Tuesday in late spring, that Choi Sung-jae was losing a significant battle with toast. The issue was not mechanical. He understood the toaster. He had purchased it himself, had read the specifications, had operated it without incident on numerous previous occasions. The issue was that he had been operating it this morning with approximately 30% of his available attention, because the remaining 70% was occupied by the small person currently standing in the middle of the kitchen floor staring at him with an expression of profound and personal judgment. Seo-jun was 3 years and 2 months old. He had his father's jaw as established and his father's brow, and Ha-jun's eyes, dark, steady, the kind of eyes that looked at things directly and without performance, that saw what was actually there rather than what was convenient. He was wearing a shirt with a duck on it that he had selected himself from the drawer that morning and defended with a seriousness that had brooked no negotiation. He was holding a toy truck in one hand. He was not doing anything with the truck. He was simply standing in the middle of the kitchen floor, truck in hand, and staring at Sung-jae with the focused, unhurried attention of someone conducting an assessment. The toast emerged. It was, by any objective measure, significantly darker than intended. Sung-jae looked at it. Seo-jun looked at it. There was a brief shared silence in which both parties arrived at the same conclusion through different processes. Burnt, Seo-jun said. He had recently discovered the power of single-word verdicts and was deploying them with increasing frequency and accuracy. It's fine, Sung-jae said. Seo-jun looked at him with the expression of someone who had inherited, from two separate sources, an absolute intolerance for imprecision. Burnt, he said again, with the patient emphasis of a person clarifying something for someone who had not understood them the first time. Sung-jae looked at the toast. He looked at his son. He put the toast in the bin and started again. Seo-jun, satisfied, redirected his attention to the truck. From the doorway, Ha-jun watched. He was leaning against the frame with his shoulder, still in the loose shirt he had slept in, hair not yet dealt with, a cup of tea held in both hands the way he held things in the morning. Carefully, like warmth was a resource to be conserved. He had been standing there for 2 minutes. Neither of the kitchen's other occupants had noticed him, which was something he had found, over 3 years, to be one of the reliable small gifts of his life. The moments he could stand in a doorway and watch the two of them without being observed, without having to arrange his face into anything, without the moment being altered by his presence in it. He was tired. He was always tired now, in the specific, textured way of people who are tired because their lives are full rather than because their lives are empty, which was a distinction he had come to understand was enormous. Seo-jun had been awake at 5 a.m. with a dream that he had described, with great seriousness, as involving a large dog and an unspecified injustice. Ha-jun had sat with him for 40 minutes until the injustice had been processed and sleep had been renegotiated. He had not minded. He had sat in the dark of the small room with his son's head on his shoulder and thought, as he thought sometimes in those quiet middle-of-the-night moments, about a hospital room and a phone call and the specific texture of a fear he no longer lived inside, and had felt the distance between then and now as something physical, like a change in altitude. He watched Sung-jae crouch down to Seo-jun's level, both of them now examining the truck with an apparent seriousness that the truck had done nothing to earn. Sung-jae said something low. Seo-jun responded with a counter-argument that involved pointing. Sung-jae listened to the counter-argument with the full, grave attention he brought to things, nodded slowly as though a significant point had been made, and then attempted to look at the underside of the truck and was denied, because Seo-jun pulled it back and held it against his chest with the proprietary conviction of someone who had decided that inspection rights had not been granted. Ha-jun pressed his lips together against something warm and said, from the doorway, "He's not going to let you look at it." Both heads turned. Seo-jun's face reorganized immediately into the expression he reserved for Ha-jun in the mornings. Open, uncomplicated, the full beam of it, the thing that hit Ha-jun in the chest every single time without diminishment. He crossed the kitchen at the slightly unstable speed of a 3-year-old who had decided on a destination and had not yet fully coordinated all relevant systems, and collided with Ha-jun's legs, and tipped his face up. "Appa," he said, with the satisfaction of someone completing a circuit. Ha-jun crouched and pulled him in, tea somehow still in hand, and pressed his mouth to the top of Seo-jun's head, and stayed there for a moment. When he looked up, Sung-jae was watching from the middle of the kitchen with the expression he wore in these moments. The one that had no armor in it anywhere, that had taken the better part of a year to appear, and had been appearing with increasing ease ever since. Not soft, exactly. Sung-jae did not do soft, but open, in the specific way of someone who has stopped defending a perimeter because he has decided, with full deliberation, that what's inside it is worth being seen. "The toast," Ha-jun said. "I'm handling the toast," Sung-jae said. "You said that 20 minutes ago." The first attempt was a calibration. Ha-jun stood, Seo-jun on his hip, and moved to the kitchen table and sat down, and the morning light came through the east-facing window at its considered angle and did its work on the room. And Sung-jae turned back to the toaster with the focused application of a man who had run a criminal empire for 8 years and was currently bringing that same energy to breakfast, and Seo-jun watched him from Ha-jun's lap with judicial attention, truck still held against his chest. The toast emerged. Pale gold. Correct. Sung-jae looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Seo-jun. Seo-jun looked back, considered, gave a single, magnanimous nod. Ha-jun laughed, a real one, quiet and unguarded, the kind that came from somewhere below performance. And Sung-jae set the toast on the table and sat down across from them both, and the morning continued its ordinary, irreplaceable work, and outside the bakery at the end of the street was opening, and the school at the other end was filling, and the city moved around them as cities do, vast and indifferent and utterly unaware that the most feared alpha in Seoul was sitting in a kitchen inn. Mapo, losing staring contests with a toddler, burning toast in the spring light. He had never, in his life, been happier. And he knew it. That was the thing. He knew it while it was happening, which was the rarest kind of happiness, the kind that didn't require distance or loss to become visible. He sat at his table with his son and the person he had loved badly, and then lost, and then found in a hospital room at the cost of everything he had built. And he knew exactly what he had, and exactly what it had cost, and he would not have changed a single variable. Seo-jun reached across the table and picked up a piece of toast. Mine, he said. Yes, Sung-jae agreed. Yours.